We're continuing with our sermon series today over the book of 2 Thessalonians called Return of the King. And if you remember, this sermon series is about this church, the Thessalonian church, where they had very little time with Paul, and then after he left, they faced great persecution, and yet they responded with great joy and worship of God. They responded with faithfulness and love. And so the problem that they experienced here was that in their faithfulness, they didn't have a lot of knowledge. And one of the things that they worried about was the second coming of Christ and whether or not they would miss out on the kingdom of God, and whether or not those who had died would miss out on the kingdom of God. And we come to the third chapter today, and we'll cover half of it this week, half of it next week, and then we'll be through this sermon series. And as we wrap up this book in the third chapter, it's important to understand that Paul is going to bring together some important things that are real lessons for us. Remember, we're looking at this primarily because we want to understand how is it that we become a joyful and worshipful people in the midst of hardship. And as we look at this passage today, we're going to go into some deep things, some heady things. And I know that as I look out in front of you, all of you got a good 8 hours plus of rest last night. You all had good breakfasts, and all of you are ready to put your thinking caps on. Some of you have the twist kind, some of you the magnetic kind. Velcro is okay. Whatever your thinking cap type is, I would ask you to put it on now. And with your permission, we'll go into some things that are a little bit heady. And the reason we want to do that today is because something comes up in this text that's important, and it's helpful for us to understand what's happening in this text, to go into some deeper ideas about really what life is about from a biblical perspective. So are you guys okay with that? We're going to go into you guys I'm getting mixed messages here. Are we ready? Okay, we're ready. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 1. Finally, brothers, pray for us that the word of the Lord may speed ahead and be honored as happened among you, and that we may be delivered from wicked and evil men. For not all have faith, but the Lord is faithful. He will establish you and guard you against the evil one. And we have confidence in the Lord about you that you are doing and will do the things that we command. May the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and to the steadfastness of Christ. Now, there's some really important things happening here, and I want to direct your attention to verse 3. The Lord is faithful. He will establish you and guard you against the evil one. Now, here's what's kind of potentially problematic in this verse, and that is this, that you could make the argument that the Thessalonians here in this church have not been guarded against the evil one. They have been persecuted. They have had their lives turned upside down. They have had members of the church killed, and they have lost livelihoods, and they have lost property, and they have faced extreme and severe persecution. And so the problem that we have here is that it would be easy to respond with, oh, you mean like he's done so far? And that's a real concern and a real thing to be dealt with. So what does it mean that he's going to establish them and guard them against the evil one? And then in verse 5 it says, may the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and the steadfastness of Christ. So apparently from Paul's perspective, that even in the midst of trouble and persecution and hardship and even death, they have been protected from the evil one. And God is continuing to protect them, and God has been showing His love through Jesus Christ to them in the midst of this. And so the problem that we encounter here is, how do we understand this? Because it seems like a guarantee that doesn't work out very well. How many of you guys have ever had a warranty or a guarantee, and then the problem is the fine print comes and you realize that you weren't really protected from anything at all? Has anybody ever faced that? That's kind of what this seems like, because you look at what their church has gone through and you say, well, how does this work out? Well, we want to look at a few things today, and we want to look at, first of all, what does it mean to have life to the full? Because in understanding that, we'll understand a little bit about what they've been protected from. We want to look at covenantal faith and faithfulness, because God's faithfulness It says in verse 3, the Lord is faithful. God's faithfulness is really what's at issue here. And then finally, we want to look at enlarging the border. And the problem is right now you don't know what that means. Fair enough. Hopefully by the end you will know what it means. If you don't know at the end of this what enlarging the border means, then please come see me afterwards because I have failed miserably and I deserve your chastisement. So let's look first of all at life to the full. We want to understand what the Bible means by life, because what the Bible means by life and what we mean by life are two different things. John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus says this. He says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. That's not very good. Thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Now, who is he talking about there? He's talking about Satan. Satan is the thief that comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But he says, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. Now here's the problem. Jesus says that he's come for us to have life, but then he also says that if they hated me, they're going to hate you too. So whatever Jesus means by life to the full or life abundantly, somehow persecution doesn't counteract that in Jesus' mind. Somehow he means something different than what we often mean, because a lot of times we look at that and say, well, wait a second, if I'm facing persecution and hardship and difficulty, then that's the opposite of life to the full. The problem is that for most of us, what we think of as life to the full comes out of a travel agency poster, right? How many of us, yeah, right? Like, on the beach somewhere, maybe with a Mai Tai or something, in our hand, some kind of umbrella drink, whatever it might be. It could be Kool-Aid, punch, whatever. But it needs to have one of those little umbrellas in it. And we need to be sitting there and just soaking up, maybe have some pictures on our Instagram account of it. That's life to the full. But according to Jesus, that's actually not what life to the full is about. So let's look at the biblical understanding of life. So what is life biblically? Well, life is to grow, to mature, to expand, to become glorious, to become numerous. Okay? So think of what happens. How many of you have ever had a cold? How many of you have ever been sick in any way? How many of you have experienced the great tribulation of our time, the COVIDs? And you've had that, or you tried to protect yourself from it, and what happened was that some kind of germ got in you. And what did that germ do when it got in you? It had a party, didn't it? And it didn't stay one little germ or a few germs or 1,000 germs or 1,000,000 germs. It multiplied and it spread throughout your body, and pretty soon you were sick. And you said to God, why, God? Why did you do this to me? And you wonder about the world, and you wonder about God, and you wonder about life, and you say, God, how could you make things like this? Well, this is what things are made to do. Things grow, and things develop, and they become more numerous. That's what life is. They develop, they become more complex, they take over things. If you've ever had a backyard in your life, you know that all you have to do is not do anything, and pretty soon life will take over your backyard. All kinds of things will end up there. Things you don't want, things you don't like. And they will become more and more numerous until you get out there and you put a stop to it and you say, no, not here, life, not today. Right? But that's what life does. It just grows and it flourishes. Now, there's good things about that, right? If you've ever had a fruit tree, you put this little seed in the ground, and pretty soon out comes this fruit tree, and after a few years, you have more fruit than you know what to do with, and you can't even give it away. You've got so much of it. But that's the intention that God has, and God has that intention for you in your life, that you would grow, that you would mature, that you would expand, that you would become glorious and numerous. Now, to Adam and Eve, God said, fill the earth and subdue it. What? Become numerous. And when we look at maturity, when we see a child grow, we understand that this is part of what life is, right? You don't want that baby to stay a baby. Now, maybe if you're a mom, because I've noticed there's a difference between moms and dads. Now, this isn't always true, but this is generally true, is that moms kind of love that infant stage. And as dads, we know we're too rough for that stage. We'll break them at that stage. And so we like it when they get a little older and they can wrestle and we can push them down and they'll pop back up and be okay. right? We like that stage, and the other stage is a little too fragile for us. But what we love as dads is to see the kids grow and mature. Now, I know women do too, but they always miss that stage, that little infant stage. But here's the thing, they don't stay that way, do they? In fact, I remember, how many of you guys remember when you had kids, if you had kids, you remember getting those cute little outfits at the baby shower? And some of them, depending on what kind of clothing they were for what type of time of the year, some of those cute clothes that you got, you maybe saw your kids wear them once and maybe not even at all, because by the time that the season lined up with where you were at and the kind of clothes that they were past that. And so you just regift it to somebody else. So what happens here is that that's the nature of life, maturing, learning, taking more dominion, growing. This is what life is. And in fact, we see a great picture of this in the prayer of Jabez. How many of you guys remember that, the prayer of Jabez? There was a book. I'm not suggesting go read the book because I don't think it's that good, but the thing is that there's this prayer in the Bible, and Jabez, this guy we don't really know much about him, he prays this prayer in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 10. It says, Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, "Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm, so that it might not bring me pain." And God granted what he asked. So what is he asking? He's asking to enlarge his border and keep him from loss, keep him from pain. Because that's what life is. Life is about expanding what you are and what you have and protecting yourself from that being taken away from you. And if you think about it, almost everything we do falls into one of these two categories, doesn't it? Like you decide you're going to take a college class. Why? Because you want your knowledge to expand. You want to grow. You want to be able to take over more things at your work or more knowledge. You want more of that. And then what else do? You protect yourself from loss. You buy an insurance policy. You put a lock on your fence, right? You do something that keeps what you have from being taken away from you. That's the idea of life. Now, here's the thing that we really have to understand is that life happens on different levels. And there's more than just physical life going on. I went to the doctor about 3 months ago, the cardiologist, and the cardiologist said to me that I had too much life going on. Anybody ever have that experience? Man, you got way too much life. Let's get rid of some of that life. I had expanded too much. And I said to the doctor, but doctor, my theology teaches me that life is about expanding. And he said, you'll find the limits of that very quickly. No, I made that whole conversation up. He did tell me that I had too much life going on, though. And so I had to reduce the amount of life that I had accumulated. Now, here's the thing. Too much. We take this, and this is really true. Like, you shouldn't stay an 8-pound baby. If you're 40 years old and you weigh 8 pounds, there's problems. But the thing is that physically you can only expand so much, and so life has to happen on different levels. There's a limit to how much good the expansion is doing us in the physical realm. And so we have to stop expanding in the physical realm, and we have to start expanding in other parts. There's different levels of life, and we have to recognize that. And what's really interesting is we kind of know this is true, because how many of you have ever had comfort food? How many of you have ever had comfort food? How many of you ever engaged in comfort eating? That can be great, right? And the thing is, you experience some kind of sadness that happened for a loss, and what do we do to make up for that loss? We get out some ice cream. Because obviously that's the answer to our loss, right? Is ice cream. Have you thought about why we do this? There's something psychological going on in us that recognizes that growth and greaterness is the idea of life, and that we've experienced some loss and we can't deal with that loss in that realm, and so we try to deal with that loss in another realm. We say to ourselves, well, this will solve the problem. This makes me feel better. Have you thought to ask yourself, why does that make you feel better? It makes no sense unless you understand that this is the way that life occurs to us. And that when we can't fix it on one level, we try to expand and grow at another level. Because what you really wanted is you wanted an expansion in this level. You wanted your relationship with somebody to grow and become deeper and become stronger and become bigger and better. And maybe that didn't work out, or maybe the person passed away. Have you thought about why when somebody dies, what do? We have a service or a wake, and there's almost always food as a part of that. Why? Because we're symbolizing something. That we've experienced a loss, our life has gotten smaller in one area, and symbolically we want to fix that, and so we do that on the level that we know how to do it on. But the problem is that that's obviously not a great way to go. Because our lives are not just physical. That we have to level up in our life. We have to go to something that's beyond and higher than the physical level. And so we actually seek to expand our lives from the side of spiritual or mental or psychological life. Because you can expand life or contract life on all different kinds of levels. When we level life down, we take more dominion over something. Have you ever wondered why it is when you clean up your house, you feel good about it? You know what I'm talking about, right? How many of you have experienced that? You like put it off and you put it off and you put it off. Like the garage is a mess and you go out there and you clean it up and man, afterwards you feel good. Why? Because your life has expanded. Your influence has grown. Your influence, your mark, your life is now imprinted on that garage. And before it was just chaos. And now it's a reflection of you. You've grown. And so we like that. And that's why people seek out power. Is because they want their influence to expand and grow. That's why we live the way that we do. But we can also level up. We can level down and take over more things beneath us, but we can level up and go to higher orders of life. How many of you guys have a favorite sports team that you follow? Anyone here? Anybody at all have a favorite sports team that they follow? Okay, good. When I was a kid, that was the Dallas Cowboys. I've told you that, and every time I say it, it's just like I can see the pain and frustration and disappointment on the faces of everybody in the audience. And so I will not bring up the Dallas Cowboys. We will choose today the Chiefs. Anyone a Chiefs fan? Anyone? All right, so this is for you then. So here's the thing. If you've ever been a fan of a sports team, have you ever asked why we do something so silly? It seems silly. I'm not saying that you're silly. I'm just saying that we do this in general. Right? We do something, and it's really weird because you become a fan of a team. And how do you know when you're a fan of the team? Because you watch the games, right? You watch them, you look, and you're invested in them, and you cheer. That's part of the thing you got to do. And you can't even help yourself. If you're a fan of the team, try not to cheer when they do something good. You can't do it. Why? It's weird. It's weird. Like you can't stop yourself from doing that. And then what do? If you're a big fan, you have to go out and you have to buy the jersey. And it's like $300 or $700 or $5,000. I don't even know how much they are now, but it's expensive. It's like a gallon of gas, right? And you go out there and you lay that money on the table and you can't wait for it to come. Now, you can get a knockoff, but you want the real thing, the thing with all the patches, the certificates of authenticity and all that stuff. And then now you're showing and you wear that jersey while the team is playing and you're part of it and you want to go to the game and so you pay. And that's like, who knows how much that is? That's like 5 gallons of gas to go to the game. And so you spend that money and you go to the game. And here's the thing. Have you ever thought about why you're doing any of it? Because you're identifying with the team. And so their victories, in a sense, become your victories. And their drama becomes your drama. And you sit there on the edge of your seat, and if they're playing a big game, you're on the edge of your seat, and it's like you're not a part of the team, but you are a part of the team. Why? Because you've identified with that team, and now when they win, you say this to your friends. We won. Right? That's what you say. We won. When did you get hired? You didn't, but you feel it. Now, here's the thing. You're doing in a small way what a player on the team is doing, right? That if you're a player on the team, you're investing yourself. And that team's, why are you doing that? Why are you joining a team? Why is somebody going out there? Obviously, because they're getting millions of dollars. But even people who aren't getting millions of dollars still join teams. We have a church softball team, right? And the thing is, we've got some trophies. We have some trophies, and we have people who have been doing this for years. Every single season, they go out, and I see them. They come in, especially the first game of the season. It's on a Saturday night, and Sunday morning, they walk in, and they're doing this, right? Their arm is hanging down. They got, their eyes not right back in the socket yet. They haven't, right? They're all beat up and bruised up, and they do it every single season, and they're not getting paid. Why? Because their life is expanding. Their life is growing. And what happens is the team's victories become their victories, and they achieve something by being a part of the team that they couldn't achieve on their own. And you do that when you invest yourself in somebody, and that's really what Old Testament sacrifice is about. I was listening to a guy named Jonathan Pajot lecture about this week, and it was really fascinating because this is what sacrifice in the Old Testament is you invest yourself in something, and you become part of it, and it becomes part of you, and your life expands. And this happens on so many different levels. It happens on so many different levels, and some levels are really important, and some aren't as important. People can go too far. You've probably met that fan that's a little bit too much of a fan. It's affecting their life in bad ways. Because not everything can return something commensurate with the investment that's possible to make in it. But the higher level you go, the more that thing can return to you, and so the more it's valid to make an investment in it. I read to you guys a while ago the Bixby letter. You guys remember, from Abraham Lincoln? It says, it's a very short letter, I'll read it to you. It says, "I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln." Now, one of the fascinating things about that letter is that Mrs. Bixby apparently had one son she had 2 sons that survived the war. Not all 5 of them died. That was erroneous information. One of her sons deserted, and apparently she was no great fan of the North and not a fan of Abraham Lincoln and didn't care that he sent this letter at all. But you know what's interesting is that the letter has taken on a life of its own. It was in the movie Saving Private Ryan, and quotes of it have been found on different war memorials all over the United States because it taps into something that we all know is true. This last phrase that it tells us, I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. That's the most well-known part of the letter. It's used over and over and over again. And nobody ever says, well, you're just talking nonsense, Abraham. Nobody says that. Why? Because we know that there's an element of truth in that. How could you have such impetuousness, such a lack of understanding to go to somebody who's lost 5 sons, or that you think has lost 5 sons, and say something like that you must have pride to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom without some kind of inkling that there's something very human about this idea, that somehow you have identified with the nation in such a way that laying the bigger sacrifice you lay on that altar, that the bigger reward is yours. This is the bigger your life has expanded and become. How many of you, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., or you go down to the state capitol here in Arizona, you say, hey, there's my state capitol. That's my building. That's mine. And you walk in, you go, hey, guys, how's it going? How are you doing today? This is my building. Glad to see things are going well. How many of you go to the Defense Department and you say, hey, I want to see my M1 tank that I paid for? Pretty sure this last IRS bill covered it, right? You don't, right? But the thing is that it might be different for us, though. I mean, think about, like in Ukraine right now, where you have soldiers who are fighting to save their country. Do you think that they, after that kind of sacrifice, look at their nation a little bit differently? Do you think that? Of course they do. This is their country, and it's theirs in a way that it wasn't before they made the sacrifice. Because that's the nature of life, that leveling up requires sacrifice. And what's interesting about that is that we have these two things at work with us, because remember I said that life is expanding, but it's also keeping things from being taken from you. And yet sacrifice is a voluntary giving up of your life in one level to increase your life on another level. Now, we have to talk about covenantal faith and faithfulness, because this is what's really at the heart of the letter that Paul writes here, is he writes that the Lord is faithful. What does that mean? Well, we talked about in John 10:10 that the devil comes to kill and steal and destroy. Kill and steal and destroy. And the idea here is that we can become smaller just like we can become bigger. And sometimes in our life, we experience that becoming smaller. C.S. Lewis in his Great Divorce, I talked last week about the fact that he wrote this story, and in this story, all the people can't stand each other, so they're constantly moving farther and farther away from each other until this city, this big city, is so huge that you can't even see the edges of it with a telescope, because everybody's just constantly irritated with each other, and they're constantly moving farther and farther away. Well, the interesting thing about the story is the protagonist of the story, he gets in this bus and he goes up to this place, to heaven, and what he talks about is he asks one of the guys in heaven, he says, well, why don't you guys come down to you say that I've been living in hell, why don't you come down to hell and tell me about why I should come up here to heaven? Why do I have to come to you? And the guy that he's talking to, he looks and he says, do you see this tiny little crack here? This vast city that's almost limitless in its size, all of that is in that tiny little crack down there. And what C.S. Lewis is trying to illustrate is that even though these people are getting farther and farther away from each other, they're actually becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Why? Because they no longer identify with anything but themselves. And so their lives have not added up to anything. In fact, their lives have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And there are times in our lives where we become more and more isolated, more and more atomized, where in our lives have become smaller and smaller and smaller, and we have this desire at work, and it's the desire of evil, it's the desire of Satan, and it's the desire to be left alone. It's the desire not to make the sacrifice in order to make our lives bigger. And all of us face this in our lives, the desire to hold on to what we have, to hold on to our resources, to hold on to our time, to hold on to our lives, to hold on to our attention, to focus them on ourselves, to not invest in the community around us, to not invest in the people around us, to not invest in the family around us. And our lives can get smaller and smaller all the time. You see, the point here is an important one, and that is that when God calls us to make a sacrifice, He does it because He wants to enlarge us and to bless us, because He is the author of life, and He came to give us life abundantly. And when Satan convinces us to not sacrifice or to sacrifice to something that's unworthy. He does it to kill and to steal and destroy. You see, there's a reality that's at work that we have to understand, and that is that when we sacrifice appropriately to God, that sacrifice will always be returned to us much greater, in much more profound ways than what we put into. The idea is that when you take a seed and you plant it in the ground, you've invested, you've sacrificed that seed, but what happens is that seed grows into a plant that produces way more than what you put into it, because that's the nature of life. But what Satan desires for you to do is either to withhold it and keep it to yourself, or to give it to him so that he can steal it from you. Not every sacrifice is worthwhile. And because we experience some unworthy sacrifices, sometimes we get to the point in our lives where we don't want to make any sacrifices at all. And that's a tragedy. The reality is that the covenant that God calls us into, in fact, every covenant, is unity. And in order to be united to something, a sacrifice is always required. But the reality that this verse is talking about, and why it was so important for us to go into this, is that you will never outgive God. I want to say that again. You will never outgive God. There is no possible way, there is no scenario, there is no reality in which you will give to God something greater than He will give to you. You will always get more than you put in. Always. And in fact, while some things in life are worth a little bit of a sacrifice because they can only return a little bit, there is no limit to the sacrifice that's appropriate to God. There is no limit, because there is no limit to what He can give you. And what is being talked about here in this passage is that the Lord is faithful. What does that mean? It's talking about covenantal fidelity. That your union with God is absolute on His end. There is no scenario under which you will unite yourself to God that He will not give you more. There's no scenario in which you will make a sacrifice to God that He will not give you back multiples of what you put in. There is no way that you will ever be more united to God than He is to you. God is faithful. And so when the church at Thessalonica is going through hardship and going through difficulty, yes, they are making a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice that is an investment. It's a sacrifice that yields to them more life. Their life gets bigger because of the sacrifice, not smaller. That is how God is faithful. And that's how He establishes us and guards us against the evil one. He guards us against the thief who wants to steal and kill and destroy. Why? Because when you invest yourself with God, you get way more back. Your life gets so much bigger. Then you are guarded against what happens if you follow Satan. There is no way that the church there is ever going to lose more than God will give them if they're following Him. That's what it means for God to be faithful. And that's why it calls for us to be faithful. You will never outgive God. One of the things that's interesting is you can see this in Scripture in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. It says, Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Jesus invested Himself in the Father. The Son, Jesus Christ, invested Himself. He sacrificed Himself when God called Him to the cross. And what was the result of that investment? What was the result of that sacrifice? That all authority in heaven and on earth was given to Him. The Father says, I see the sacrifice you have made, and He returns so much more. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Him. And what does Jesus do with that? In Matthew 16:19, Jesus says to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. You see what Jesus is saying to Peter, just like me and the Father. When I sacrifice, I get way more back. When you sacrifice yourself to me, you get more back than you could ever imagine. There is no limit to what God can give you because God is not limited by any kind of limitation on what He owns or controls. God is faithful and He will establish you. So let's talk about 3, enlarging the border. Because enlarging the border is an important topic for us to talk about. What is the appropriate sacrifice? So what do you sacrifice? What does it look like when you sacrifice? Now the problem is that a lot of us, when we think of sacrifice, we think of what is called scapegoating. So a lot of times we know a sacrifice is necessary, so we look around and find a volunteer. Only they usually don't volunteer, so we volunteer them, right? This is what's wrong, and this is why you need to sacrifice. How many of you have ever experienced that in your life? Somebody volunteered you for a sacrifice. They looked around and said, "You're the reason," and they were very, very helpful in helping you to sacrifice something. The reality is, scapegoating is not useful. And the real sacrifice is the sacrifice of ourselves. Anything not fitting in with the identity of what we've chosen to identify with. Here's the thing. Let's say that you play for the Dallas Cowboys and you get tired of losing, because that's possible. And you decide that you're going to go to the Kansas City Chiefs. They've invited you, you want to go there. And you show up and you've got your Dallas Cowboys helmet and you've got your Dallas Cowboys uniform, because we all know that they're the best, right? And silver or the star, all that good stuff. And you said, red's not really my thing. It doesn't look good on me. I'm more of an autumn. I don't know if that works or not, but I just think it'd be funny for them to say that. And then, so they show up and they say, "I want to wear this uniform." Is that going to work? Nope. What are the Chiefs going to say? Got to get rid of that. But you know what? There's going to be a lot more than that. You say, "Well, this is what I did in my old team. We practiced on these days at these times." They'll be like, "Nope, you got to get rid of that." "Well, here's the thing, is that I like to run this play." "Nope, doesn't fit in with our offense. Got to get rid of that." What are you going to sacrifice? You can't just say, "I'm going to be who I am, and you guys all need to sacrifice yourselves for me." It doesn't work that way. You have to sacrifice yourself. And the truth is that God uses hardships to refine us, to help us make the sacrifices that we either don't know we need to make or that we have a hard time making on our own. Why? Because hardships take us out of our selfishness. Because the reality is that we all have evil within us. We all have a desire to isolate ourselves and to atomize ourselves. And sometimes what happens in the midst of our lives is God allows hardships into our lives that help us to get rid of things that need to be gotten rid of. We have to make the proper sacrifices for what is worthwhile. And I think one of the things that's been interesting is that during COVID, what I see happening in the world is that all of us have had an opportunity to limit our engagement. And in limiting our engagement, we've had an opportunity to become more isolated and more atomized. And there's a real issue that has to be overcome, that we have to re-engage with the world to make our lives bigger again. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, it says, Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." The reality is that when God calls us into sacrifice, that it is always for our blessing. So how do we apply this? Believe in God's glory. And we have to have total trust in who God is and in His glory. And we have to identify in our lives areas that we struggle for trust in God's love. And it's a useful exercise for us this week to think about, is there anything about God? Is there anything about His Word? Is there anything about who He is that I am not fully convinced of the goodness of, that I don't really trust in? Secondly, we need to belong to Him through the covenant. Do you trust that if He calls you to give something up, that if He calls you to sacrifice something, do you trust that it is worthwhile? Is there anything in your life that you would hold on to and not give him? Finally, we need to become glorious by being transformed by him. It's useful to us this week in our lives to ask, what areas have we become isolated and atomized? What areas am I being called to sacrifice in that I don't? And this is a bigger thing. It could be in your family. It could be in your community. It could be in your church. It could be in a lot of things. There's a lot of things that maybe we've gotten into the habit of closing ourselves off from. And we have to ask ourselves, and it's really important to examine this week in our lives, what areas are we holding on to? Because the reality of the situation is that God desires to bless us. And the only thing that holds us back is our lack of faith in him. But God is faithful. He will establish you and keep you from the evil one.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to his church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.